for meeting after meeting after meeting, Jim has consistently urged the council to look at other alternatives and to get smarter before it makes $70 million decisions, and I would applaud him for that. A lot to learn to do.
So much fun.
And why don't you I was debating whether to go.
You don't need to preach, but everybody can see it. You're a little better light up there.
Well, here's just an interesting map of Tumalo Creek. Here's Bend down here. The blue is Tumalo Creek, and so you have Tumalo Creek sources on this side and Bridge Creek over here. This is Broken Top up here. If you go up into the Broken Top crater, there's a glacier up there that feeds into one of the arms of or branches of Tumalo Creek and comes down and is diverted above Tumalo Falls over into Bridge Creek. And then it flows down where it's diverted the second time into the city's water pipes, which in this map are depicted in green. And if you look down below this map, you can see a volumetric graph that shows the volume that flows in the river at various points. So at this point where the city's second diversion comes, which is just below the Tumalo Falls, although it does affect the volume of the falls because we divert up here above the falls, you can see that this blue line depicts how much water is flowing down Tumalo Creek at that point. And then the green is how much water is diverted. So if the city were to discontinue using its creek water and instead put it back in the stream for the fish, this blue line could be added to the blue line, or excuse me, the green line could be added to the blue line, and it would be that much bigger for Tumalo Creek, that much more for the fish. And as you travel downstream, below Tumalo, or excuse me, below Shoveling Park, into this final stretch of the river, which most of us don't see because it's private property on both sides, but there's at least a possibility that that's going to be part of Bend in our future, and it certainly could become a park that connects to the Deschutes and comes back up on the river trail. Well, that section of the creek during a typical August day, by the way, this is a map that was prepared by the Oregon Water Resources Department hydrologist, Jonathan LaMarche. You can see that because of the irrigation outtakes that leave the creek at that point, on a typical summer day, you have a basic trickle down that section of the creek. I was down this summer, and I could stand with a foot on each side of Tumalo Creek, and my feet would both be dry. Most of you probably didn't know that section of Tumalo Creek has so little water flowing through it. It's the difference between being able to skip a rock through the creek and being able to literally skip over the creek. And so it makes a huge difference, especially to this portion of the creek, and somewhat with the section in Shoveling Park, whether the city continues to use this water or places it back in stream. And what's also kind of interesting is I took the city's engineers' chart that showed how much money they're going to make selling hydroelectricity and the volume of water they're going to pull out of the creek. And I put that on the chart, and this is in the future. And it's depicted in the red. That's the amount of water they're pulling over the course of the year. And then on the same chart, I took the exact amounts that the city of Bend is pulling from the river to use for water. And I put those in blue. This is for 2010. And as you can see, it isn't a marginal impact on the creek of pulling just a little bit more out. There's a whole lot of red still showing on this chart, so it's going to have a big impact on the creek. Less so right here in the middle of summer because the city doesn't have much in terms of water rights that are very good that time of year. So about the time of year when you really need the water on that hot day, because there's other users on the creek and because the city has some more junior rights to get some of its water out, the city can only get about 7.4 million gallons a day out of the creek during the peak demand season. And that's what you really build your infrastructure for. You don't build it for the average day or the low day. You build it for the peak day. And Jim had talked about how the city gets about half of its water currently from surface water and the other half from wells. And that's true, but that's by choice. The city actually has wells already in place that you all have already paid for that will supply about 150% of the peak day demand. Last year, on July 25th, was a peak summer day for the city of Bend, and the city used 21.9 MGD. On that day, it had about 20 MGD of well capacity sitting idle. Didn't even have to turn on the pumps because they had that much extra sitting around. And so, rather than spending $60, $70 million on this system, you could just turn a few more wells on, kick the can down the road a little ways, and see what develops in terms of the technology for treatment, see what develops in terms of whether we really need this system, see whether the city continues to grow, and check into some of those things, while maintaining the option to continue the dual source system. There is some appeal, and I think Jim explained it well, to having a dual source system. It's not what appeals, to be quite honest with me, but if you were to go with a dual source system, there are some really pretty good options. One of those options, if you look at this map, you think, okay, we're going to spend $30 million pulling water from this point on the creek. Well, first of all, we pull it here, and this, by the way, means an attention. We haven't looked at the cost of updating that and the diversion facility there. We're going to build a big pipeline, $30 million worth, to bring it down to here. Now, when this system was initially built in 1926, and the next pipe was built in the 1950s, there's two of them here parallel. The reason why they put the pipe way up here was because they didn't have a treatment system, they didn't even have a chlorination system, and they wanted to get as close to the source as they could to get the freshest, cleanest water. As long as you're going to build a treatment plant, though, and as long as you have chlorination already in place, which the city does, then there really isn't any reason to go way up here. It's pretty darn clean water right here next to where you're getting it. So why are we spending $30 million to pump water or to bring water parallel to a creek that brings it there anyway? And nobody ever really seriously considered the possibility that you could cut almost $30 million off this plan by building a short pipe right at the creek. I wouldn't build it straight into the creek because then you have to pull it out of the creek a little ways and you need a little electricity. But all you do is go up here to right this point or this point, where the pipe already goes right next to the creek. It should be no problem. And some people say, well, you have to change your point of diversion, the Oregon Water Resources Department, and the environmentalists might get in the way of that. But ask any environmentalist that deals with creek water, and you'll tell them that it's only when someone tries to move a point of diversion upstream that they would counter that. Moving it downstream means the water gets to stay in the creek longer and be used and swam in by fish longer. So of course they're not going to oppose a move of a diversion point downstream, it's only upstream. So you would have a point of diversion down here, you could lop off a whole lot of money. Another thing, if you look at the actual reports that talked about the condition of the pipes that Jim referred to, the condition of the 1926 pipe has some serious problems, and it is approaching the end of its useful life. The technology for pipes in the 20s was not nearly as good as it was in the 50s. Those reports are conspicuously silent about the condition of the 50s pipe. There are very few problems that are specifically mentioned, and they don't have the situation where they're going under some of the homes where people have encroached on the city's right-of-way. Although the city has the right to do that. So one of the other options is, gosh, and by the way, the city hired a value engineering team that looked at the condition of the 1950s pipe in a not a real close look, but at a distant look, and said, hey, well, there's no reason to suspect that 1950s pipe is really in imminent danger of a problem. After all, the 20s pipe lasted as long as it did. We ought to get at least 30 more years out of the 50s pipe. The 30s pipe or excuse me, the 50s pipe carries 6 million gallons a day of water. And the city's water rights, which the city acknowledges in all of its water utility master plans, are only reliably providing the city with 7.4 MGD. So if all we did was said, okay, we're going to abandon the 1920s pipe, go with the 1950s pipe, we'll put 1.4 MGD back in the river for fish in exchange for mitigation credits, which the Water Resources Department would give them to allow them to pump more groundwater. So you do get something for your turning that 1.4 back. And then you take the 6 million gallons a day that you already get through the 1950s pipe, and you continue using that until the end of the useful life of that pipe, which should be at least 30 years, because that's how long the 1920s pipe has lasted. It could be much longer than that, but the city hasn't done that, hasn't really looked at that alternative very closely. And once the 1950s pipe fails or becomes more expensive to maintain than is worthwhile, then of course you could build a short pipeline over here to replace it rather than building a $30 million pipeline to replace it. And then instead of building a 14 MGD membrane treatment plant at a huge expense, you build one that actually matches the amount of rights that you have, which is closer to 7.4 or in this case 6 MGD, and you use UV as a cheaper treatment alternative, and you save a ton of money. So this starts to look more like an $8 or a $10 million surface water project, and you've retained 6 of the 7.4 MGD peak day capacity that the city's reports acknowledge that that's all they have. It's only in the middle of winter or in the fall and spring that the city's water rights allow it to pull a great deal of water. But guess what? The city really doesn't use that much water during those times of year because it's raining or it's snowing. In fact, if you look at the initial, this is sort of interesting going back in the history of this board. When the city initially approved moving forward with this project in 2009, they did so based on, actually there hadn't even been a report published yet. There was just a PowerPoint presentation that contained a graph and some information. I did a public record request and looked into that information. And what the consultants were relying on to do that was massive taxpayer hydroelectric subsidies that would make that project look financially feasible. And I remember when the council voted, several of the councilors voted in favor of it, but they said, if these assumptions, these Herculean assumptions, that the hydroelectric facility will make this project float, if we get into the due diligence and those are wrong, we want to hear about it, because we then might have a pipeline to nowhere, and we would want to consider the groundwater alternative, or some other alternative. A year later, Sonia Andrews, the city's financial guru, sends out an email, August 16th of 2010, saying that, guess what? Those hydroelectric assumptions we were all counting on haven't panned out. And they still haven't panned out. There were investment tax credits that they were planning on. There were Etsy tax for credits that they were counting on. And those never materialized. And so Mayor Eager, I think wisely, said, you know what, I said I wasn't ruling out other alternatives. City staff, why don't you take a second look at groundwater?